So when you finish a project, you're going to be left with yarn that's on your needle, like that, which you cut, and you need to leave enough so that you can weave those ends in. And unlike sewing, you can't just tie a knot in your yarn and cut it, because eventually over time it will work itself loose. You'll get frayed edges, and you also run the risk of, can you see there, your work unpicking. So however tempting it might be just to tie a knot and cut your wool, it's worth spending time weaving your ends in properly. So I've got this sample knit with super chunky wool so you can see all of the stitches, and I'm using a different colour yarn so you can see what I'm doing. But just imagine that this is my super chunky yellow that I've just cut off my needle when I finished. So we're going to take our darning needle and pick a stitch that we can move diagonally from. So I haven't just gone straight into the stitch underneath where I've cut it. I've picked a stitch that I can move diagonally, and then I'm going to work down on the diagonal. I've gone in that stitch to this stitch, the row below. Now, don't be tempted to pull your yarn so tight that you misshapen your work. So we've gone into this stitch. Now we're going to pick a stitch next to that stitch. So it doesn't matter if it's this one or that one, as long as it's next to. So I'm going to pick the one next to it, and then we go back into the same stitch. And I'm not knitting through the wool, I'm going in and under the stitch. So I'm not bringing my needle through the wool, I'm going in and through the loop. So 2 stitches used there, 1 stitch used there. And now we're going to do the same. We're going to choose the stitch next to the one we've just gone into. So into the stitch, and then back into that stitch. So we're picking a new stitch each time and then working back into the old stitch. So again, pick a stitch that's next to the stitch we've just worked, a new stitch, back into the old stitch, new stitch, back into the old stitch. I'm going to do that one more time. New stitch, back into the old stitch. Actually, one more time. I want my yarn to end up down here rather than on the edge. So new stitch, back into the old stitch. And now you can cut your yarn knowing that you've still got stretchiness, you've still got give, and you can barely see the stitches even though I've used a completely different colour. So if you imagine that that was the same colour yarn, so if we do just that, use the same colour yarn on smaller stitches. So this is the same yarn, same colour. So I'm not going straight in, I'm choosing a stitch that I can work diagonally from. So diagonally down into a stitch, like that. Don't need to pull it too tight. A stitch next to it and back into the same stitch. Stitch next to it, back into the same stitch. Now obviously the smaller the yarn you've used, the smaller your stitches will be. So I would say to start with, just practice on some quite thick yarn. And the darker the yarn you've used, the trickier it can be as well, especially when you're using the same colour. It was quite easy to see with that red on the yellow. And I'm just going to do it one more time. New stitch, back into the old stitch. Give that a snip. And do be careful when you're cutting this that you don't cut the yarn below. I have done that. I'm sure every knitter has, so just take care when you're snipping that yarn that you are only snipping the yarn. And there you can see you absolutely cannot see those stitches.